She had nothing. No money, no family, no way out. Nearly $100,000 in debt, working on her knees in the mansion of the most dangerous man in Chicago. A man who looked right through her every single day. She wasn't supposed to speak, wasn't supposed to make a sound. She was invisible, and she knew it. But on a Saturday night, just before midnight, this woman, this maid, discovered a murder plot so close to home, it would shatter everything. She could have stayed silent. Nobody would have blamed her. He had never shown her a single moment of kindness. So why did she pick up that phone? Because what happened in the next 30 minutes didn't just save one man's life. It broke open 17 years of buried betrayal, a brother's smile that was never real, a loyalty that was always a lie, and a grief so old it had turned into poison. And at the center of it all, a broken music box, and two people who had no idea they were carrying the exact same wound. The people the world overlooks are often the ones carrying the most courage. True loyalty doesn't come from power. It comes from people who have everything to lose and still choose to do what's right. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me. And while you're here, hit that like button and subscribe, because every week I bring you stories that will make you feel everything. Drop a comment below. Would you have made that call?
Inside a mansion where the silence screamed louder than any weapon. Chicago is a city that never really sleeps, but when the sun goes down, it becomes something else entirely. As regular folks lock up for the night, another city stirs. A city where cash is tallied in rooms without windows and bargains are struck in the basements of ordinary-looking restaurants. A world where one nod could make a man vanish without a question asked. I saw glimpses of it, the casinos hidden behind Chinatown laundromats, the cargo moving through the harbor at 3 in the morning, the real estate deals paid for with cash from black duffel bags. And at the very center of that web, the name everyone feared to speak was Ailio Ferraro. 36 years old, methodical, cold, and most dangerous when he was completely silent. His empire ran from here to Miami, a collection of luxury hotels, properties, and restaurants. But what was hidden under that legitimate surface was a secret very few people knew, and those who knew kept their mouths shut. In his world, they didn't use his name. They called him the Ghost, because his moves were invisible until it was too late. His estate in Lake Forest was shielded by ancient oak trees and high walls. Gray stone. From the road, it just looked like another rich guy's house. But inside, the air was thick with tension. Black marble, dim lighting, dark leather furniture, and the smell of cigars and oak. There was no joy in that home, no music, just a crushing silence. And in that quiet, his power was undeniable. All of us on the staff knew the rules. Don't meet the boss's eyes unless he addresses you. Don't make a sound when he walks by. Never ask about his plans, his meetings, or his business. The staff learned to move like phantoms, cleaning and then vanishing from sight. Here, you only existed if you were unnoticed. But there was one man who played by different rules. Hugo Caruso, 40 years old, with short salt and pepper hair and the broad shoulders of a man who'd buried more than his share of secrets. Hugo started with Ailio when he was just a wounded, angry kid of 20, long before he was the boss. Hugo was his confidant, the only person who could walk into Ailio's office unannounced, the only one brave enough to tell him when he was wrong, and the only one who knew that every night, Ailio went into a small room on the second floor that was off-limits to everyone. Hugo never asked why. He knew better. Hugo's devotion wasn't about money or influence. It was forged on a night 17 years ago when Ailio, his face covered in blood, pulled Hugo out of the aftermath of a mob war and said, "Live, I need you." Hugo had been by his side ever since. In a house where we were all terrified, where silence was the common tongue, Hugo Caruso was the only person Ailio Ferraro seemed to trust. But even Hugo had his limits. Because at the end of the dark second-floor hallway, there was a door that was always locked. And behind it was the one secret the ghost kept all to himself. That room was just a few feet from Ailio's own bedroom, yet none of us ever dared to go near it. There was no special lock, no camera, just a plain oak door with an old brass handle. But we all understood it was his sanctuary, and entering without an invitation was like writing your own death warrant. He kept the only key in his suit pocket, right over his heart, as if he were protecting something more valuable than any weapon. I only know what was in there because she told me. He let her clean it once, after everything. It wasn't what you'd think. No cold marble or leather, just a small, almost empty room. A little wooden table against a wall, a single candle in a silver holder, and on a piece of black velvet, an old music box. It wouldn't have been worth a dime at an antique shop. But to Ailio Ferraro, that box was the only thing in the world that mattered. It had been his mother's, Catherine Ferrero. He told her the story of that afternoon, still vivid after nearly 28 years. He was 8 years old, his hand clutched in his mother's as they walked down a street in Wicker Park. Autumn leaves were everywhere. The smell of coffee was in the air. Catherine paused at a small antique store, its window filled with forgotten treasures. Her eyes found the music box on a dusty shelf. She picked it up, opened it, and a soft, clear, sad melody filled the small shop. Catherine smiled a smile he never forgot. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, getting down to his level. "It's a lullaby. Whenever you're scared, I'll open it, and you'll know I'm always with you." She paid for it with her savings, and every night from then on, before Ailio went to bed, Catherine would sit with him, open the box, and hum along to the tune. It was their own private world, a place free from his father, the family business, and the shadows of the life they lived. Just a mother and her son. Then the night came. Ailio was 19. The war between the families ignited without warning. They broke down the door just after midnight. Catherine screamed, pushing Ailio behind her. He fought to shield her, and a blade cut his jaw open, but he held on to her hand. Then the shot rang out. Just one. Catherine collapsed in front of him. Her fingers were still laced with his when she hit the floor. And Ailio felt the warmth leave them as his world came crashing down around him. Paolo Ferraro, his father, survived, but he was never the same. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. 6 years later, he died in his sleep, leaving the entire operation to Ailio, who was only 25. Too young, and filled with so much rage. He built his new world on those ashes. He molded his grief into power, his loss into absolute control. But every night, after the house was still, Ailio would take the key from his pocket, unlock that door, and step into that little room. He'd light the candle and open the music box, and he would just sit there in the dark. Not the ghost, not the boss, just a son missing his mother. After she saved him, I saw him start to change, but his world was still a dangerous place. A few weeks later, I found a note dropped by the gate, a plan from his brother's old crew to get to him through her. For 2 days, I did nothing, frozen by the old fear. Then I thought of her courage. I walked to Hugo's office and slid the note under his door. It was a small act, but for me it was the first time I refused to be invisible, his mother. I'm the only one who knows. Not Hugo, not Tristan, not a soul. I saw it all from the shadows, knowing that in this house, showing your hurt is the same as showing your throat, and weakness gets you killed. That little music box is the last piece of the boy he was, a final proof that under all that ice, a heart still beats, still bleeds. I've always known if that box ever shattered, it would snap the last thread of the man inside. But Ailio wasn't the only child broken that night. Tristan Ferraro was just 15 when his mother was taken. He wasn't in the room. He was upstairs, hidden away in a linen closet, palms clamped over his ears, shaking like a leaf. I saw him go in. I heard her pleas through the floorboards and I did nothing. When the silence came, he stumbled out and found Alio on the floor, soaked in red, clutching their mother. I should have held Tristan that night. No one asked if he was okay. And I watched as something in that 15-year-old boy started to fracture, a quiet, slow splintering nobody else seemed to see. Now, 17 years on, Tristan is 32. To the world, he's the picture of the devoted younger brother, with a charm so different from Alio's. Not the cold edge that puts you on guard, but a warmth that pulls you in, makes you want to trust him instantly. A bright, wide smile, a solid handshake, a direct gaze that swears he has no secrets. But I've been watching for a long, long time, and I notice the one tiny, chilling detail. Tristan's smile is a lie. It never touches his eyes. His mouth grins, but his eyes stay cold. It's a mask he puts on with his coffee every morning and hangs up before bed. In the Ferraro empire, Tristan manages the money, cleaning it through restaurants and properties, making sure every ledger was spotless for the lawyers and outside accountants. He was brilliant at it, a real natural. But you'd never hear a word of praise for him. In every meeting, Alio was at the head of the table making the calls, while Tristan sat at his side, nodding, taking his notes, executing the plans. Nobody ever asked for his thoughts. No one ever said, "What's Tristan's take on this?" Alio commanded. Tristan complied. That was the way of things. That was the rule. And Paolo, their father, was the one who wrote that rule. Just before he passed, Paolo summoned Alio to his study, not Tristan, and declared, "You're the heir. Hold this family together." I was just outside the door, polishing the silver, and I heard it all. Their father never called for him, never even said his name, like he wasn't even there. From that day forward, Tristan kept on smiling, kept on saying, "I've got your back, brother." Always there when Alio called, always in his proper place, doing his job without a word of protest. But inside, I knew he was keeping score. He tallied every time Alio dismissed him in a meeting. He logged every instance he was sidelined from a major play. He noted every moment he stared at that chair at the end of the table, thinking, "I've earned a place there too." His anger never burst forth. It didn't have to. It just needed to fester quietly, growing a little each day, like a slow poison someone drinks without ever tasting it. And Tristan didn't just keep score. He started building a team. Ford Bellini was the first man I saw Tristan turn. 34 years old, a long-serving guard for the family. Capable, but stuck. Ford had been with the Ferraros over 10 years and was still in the same spot, watching doors, driving cars, getting his hands dirty when ordered, but never getting a seat at the table. Tristan saw that festering resentment and knew just what to offer. "When I'm running things, you won't be watching anyone's back. You'll be sitting right next to me." A taste of real power. The very thing Ford had craved for a decade, and no one had ever bothered to offer him. That was all it took. I saw Ford nod from across the lawn. Perry Rizzo was a different story. 30 years old, a sharp young bookkeeper, but with a mistake he thought was buried. A quiet dip into the family accounts a couple of years back for a few tens of thousands of dollars. Money he'd used to cover a bad gambling habit. Perry had replaced it and thought he was clear, but Tristan knew. Tristan always knew. He didn't threaten Perry. I overheard him speak to him gently, like it was nothing. "I know what happened 2 years ago. But don't you worry, that's our little secret. Just remember who is keeping it for you." There was no menace, no grand promise. Perry got the message. From that day on, he was Tristan's man. 3 men, a secret pact forged in the absolute center of the Maid Ferraro organization without a single person noticing. Tristan was the strategist, Ford was the enforcer, Perry was the accountant. They rarely met, never spoke openly, just shared moments. A quick look in a corridor, a subtle nod over dinner, a coded text in the dead of night. And Alio, The man who trusted no one, the man the entire Chicago outfit called the Ghost, trusted his brother implicitly because he was family, because Tristan was his flesh and blood, because Tristan always said, "I've got your back, brother," with the most convincing smile he could muster. But I heard the words Tristan would mutter when he was alone, staring up at the second-floor room where Alio would listen to that music box night after night. "You have it all now, but it won't be yours forever." As that cancer was spreading through the Ferraro home, across town in Chicago, a 27-year-old woman stood at the iron gates of the Lake Forest estate, a worn, canvas tote on her shoulder, with nothing to her name but a $95,000 debt and her mother's old wool scarf. Noelle Ashford, with her dark brown hair and blue-gray eyes, was thinner than she ought to be from months of going without. But she held her shoulders straight and her chin up, even as her fingers clutched her bag strap so hard her knuckles went pale. She wasn't always this way. 3 years ago, Noelle was a sophomore in the nursing program at the University of Illinois at Chicago, UIC, one of the top schools in the city. She was at the head of her class, admired by her teachers, liked by everyone. Her future was laid out. Graduate, get her license, find a position at Northwestern or Rush, get a little place in Logan Square, and look after her mother, Ruth Ashford. Her mom, the only person Noel had left. Ruth was a freelance designer, making enough to get by, but never enough to be secure. Her paychecks swung wildly with each job, making too much for Medicaid in the good months, but never enough to buy decent insurance on the open market. It's the kind of trap that snares millions of people, not poor enough for help, not rich enough to save themselves. Then they got the diagnosis: Stage 3 lung cancer. Ruth had never smoked a cigarette in her life. The doctors said it just happens sometimes. No cause, nobody to blame, just your own body turning on you. Noelle told me once she remembered the exact moment, leaning against a wall in Stroger Hospital, slowly sliding to the floor, the phone still at her ear, but hearing nothing but a dull roar inside her own head. She quit school that same week. No second thoughts, no asking for advice. Her mother was sick, and that was that. She juggled 3 part-time jobs all at once. Waiting tables in Little Italy for lunch, running a register at CVS in the afternoon, and scrubbing offices downtown late at night. 4 hours of sleep, 1 real meal a day. Every other cent was for her mother. But medical debt doesn't sleep. Chemo, radiation, prescriptions, lab work, scans. Each month, the bills stacked higher and higher, a tower I knew she could never support. And still, she tried to hold it up with her bare hands. She started borrowing from friends, then credit cards, and finally from the kind of people you should never meet. Loan sharks on the south side of Chicago, with vicious interest rates and contracts signed in red. She never read the fine print because her mother was in the ER and she needed the cash right then. She had no idea those lenders were a branch of the Ferraro family's network. Tiny streams of money flowing in from hundreds. I remember the day the quiet started. After her mother Ruth passed, it was like all the sound drained from Noel's world and from our floor. I'd see the notices pile up, official papers stamped by men who saw only a name on a ledger. Noel was just an account number to them. For 3 years, I'd heard them through the walls, Ruth's weak voice and Noel's strong one, fighting right alongside her. I remember the nights she must have held her mother, so frail, and I'd hear Noel's muffled sobs, her pleas for her mom not to leave her. But she did leave, on a cold morning when the world was still dark. I didn't hear a single cry from Noel's apartment that day, just a profound, terrifying silence that felt like the whole world had stopped breathing. When I saw her after the funeral, her eyes were empty. The debt was a monster waiting at the door, and I just stood behind mine, a coward. I watched from my window when they put the eviction notice on her door. I watched her pack what little she had into that beat-up car, and for 2 weeks, that was her home. I'd turn off my lights so she wouldn't see me watching, shame keeping my hand from knocking on her window. Then the calls turned into visits. First polite, then loud, then scary. I heard the bricks smash her window one night. The next, I saw the note they shoved under her door. Pay up or pay some other way. I heard her whisper through the thin walls, clutching that old scarf of her mom's, asking, "What am I supposed to do, Mom?" That's when he came. Hugo Caruso. He wasn't loud. He just stood there, talking to her in that calm, practical voice that was more frightening than any threat. He laid out the choices, and I knew she really only had one. I saw her nod, her shoulders so heavy, and get into his car. It wasn't a rescue, it was a capture. For months, that image burned in my mind. The guilt was a heavy coat I couldn't take off. I started taking cleaning jobs in those big houses up north, closer to Lake Forest. I told myself I was just trying to make extra money, but I was listening for any mention of her, any whisper about the girl who disappeared from Humboldt Park. I just needed to know she was alive. I was there to work, to pay my own bills, but I was really there to find a ghost, to atone for my silence when she was dragged into that luxurious prison. I had no idea if I would ever hear her name again. In those first weeks of searching, I felt as lost as she must have. I learned the rules of their world from a distance. Don't ask about the Ferraro family. Don't look too long at the fancy cars. Mind your own business. But I couldn't. I'd ask the other cleaners, the gardeners. Have you seen a young woman? Look so tired? Most just shook their heads, warning me to stay quiet. Then one afternoon, a landscaper who worked the property next door told me a story. He'd heard some commotion. A girl, a cleaner, had broken something. Something that belonged to the big boss, Alio. Something kept behind an oak door at the end of a hall, a door no one was ever supposed to open. My stomach dropped. I knew, right then, that it was Noel. Everything changed in that moment. I could see it all in my head. Noel just trying to be invisible in that huge, lonely mansion. The meeting downtown ending early. The boss coming home when no one expected. I know a cleaner's instincts. Dust doesn't wait. A slightly open door is an invitation to do your job. I could just picture her seeing that fine layer of dust and thinking, just a quick wipe, no one will ever know. I imagined her pushing the door, the smell of old wood and wax hitting her, and then seeing it. In a room full of wealth, she found the one thing that wasn't about money, the music box. I could see her moving toward it, drawn by something other than duty. It was probably old, a little worn, tarnished, not perfect. I bet it reminded her of that wool scarf she carried, a thing of no monetary value, but holding a whole life inside it. I can imagine her hand, chapped from scrubbing floors, reaching out to touch the lid. And the music, soft and sad. It must have broken through the wall she'd built around her heart. That melody probably brought her mother's voice right back into the room, singing her to sleep one last time. The tears she'd held back for so long must have finally come. The landscaper said the gardeners heard a faint, sad tune before the crash. She just wanted to hold something beautiful for a moment. Then her hand slipped. I can feel that moment of pure panic watching it fall, reaching out too late. The sound couldn't have been loud, but in that silent house, it must have echoed like a gunshot. The music dying, the gears scattering, a heart stopping. I can see her on her knees, frozen, whispering, "No, no, no," trying to gather the pieces of a memory that could never be whole again. She was trying to fix it, but she knew. You can't unbreak a thing like that. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, slow, inevitable. The sound of judgment walking up the stairs. The sound of her world about to break all over again. The landscaper said he saw the boss's shadow fall across the floor before he even appeared. Alio standing in the doorway, his eyes on the shattered box. I can only imagine the silence. Noel's heart hammering against her ribs. He bent down, picked up the broken lid, and his hand trembled. Just a little. But she would have seen it. She would have understood she'd broken more than a box. Who gave you permission to come in here? His voice, quiet, dangerous. I can hear her choking on her words. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And then he asked her if she knew what it was. She wouldn't have. She would have just shaken her head, tears blinding her. He looked at that broken wood and said so quietly, "This is the only thing in my life I can't replace." And Noel, she just cried. But I know her. She wasn't crying out of fear. She was crying because she understood. She knew what it was to hold the last piece of your mother in your hands and watch it break. He must have seen that her tears weren't for herself, but for his loss. And it stopped him. But understanding doesn't pay a $95,000 debt. It doesn't unlock the gates. And that's when I knew my silence had to end. I went home and found that threatening note I'd picked up from her floor. I put it in an envelope, no name, no return address, and mailed it to an investigative reporter I'd read about. It was a small act, a whisper against a storm, but it was something. Looked past Alio's shoulder, seeing it all, and said in his usual tone, "Want me to handle this, boss?" Alio didn't even turn. After a long pause, he said, "No, she has a debt. She isn't going anywhere." Hugo just nodded, but he didn't see what I saw. Alio's reply had nothing to do with money. It was about the moment he saw Noelle's tears and understood she wasn't weeping for herself. She was weeping for him. And Alio Ferraro, the ghost of Chicago, had no idea how to deal with that. He faced Noelle again, his gaze turning to ice, his voice a flat command. "From now on, you don't look at my face. You don't speak unless I speak to you. You don't touch a single thing that isn't on your list of duties." Noelle bowed her head. "Yes, sir. Get out." As Noelle left, her legs trembling so much she steadied herself against the wall, I waited. Behind her, the door shut. The lock clicked. I remember the day it truly began. I'd seen Mr. Ferraro alone in his study before, his face a mask of grief as he held that little broken box. But the real cold settled in the next morning. I was polishing the upstairs banister when I saw Hugo tell Noelle to gather her things. From the landing, I watched her follow him down into the darkness of the basement. I knew that room next to the laundry, damp, windowless, with gray concrete walls that sweat in the summer. It wasn't a room, it was a cage. My hands kept polishing, but my stomach twisted with a guilt I chose to ignore. Her days became a blur of endless chores, starting at 5 in the morning and not stopping until well past midnight. She did the jobs no one else would touch, from scrubbing the grout in the bathrooms to polishing every last shoe. The physical toll was obvious, but what really broke my heart was watching Mr. Ferraro treat her like a piece of furniture. He'd walk into the dining room for breakfast, and though Noel would quietly greet him, he'd look straight through her. Not with anger, but with an emptiness that was somehow worse. It was a suffocating, deliberate invisibility, and all of us saw it. I was in the kitchen when it happened. I heard the faint shatter of glass from the dining room. Peeking through the door, I saw Noelle clearing the table, her face pale. A shard from a cracked wine glass had sliced her palm open. Blood, bright red, was soaking into the dish towel she quickly wrapped around her hand. She never cried out, just kept working with her left hand as if nothing was wrong. Mr. Ferraro sat at the head of the table, not 10 feet away, his gaze fixed on a file. I was certain he hadn't noticed a thing. She carried the broken pieces into the kitchen and rinsed her hand under the faucet, biting her lip so hard I thought it would bleed too. Not 5 minutes later, Hugo came in. He didn't look at her, just set a first aid kit on the counter. "The boss sent this," he mumbled, before turning and leaving. I looked from the kit to the dining room, where Mr. Ferraro hadn't moved an inch, his head still bent over his papers. He had seen. He'd seen her bleeding, and had chosen to send help through someone else. It was a confusing, detached kind of cruelty. That afternoon, I overheard Bree and Margot whispering by the pantry. Bree, who was only 25, never could keep her thoughts to herself. "Why not just fire her?" she asked. $95,000 is nothing to him. Margot, who had been there nearly a decade, just shook her head, saying she'd never seen the boss keep someone he'd forbidden from touching his things. Something's different, Bree insisted. At the sink, Noel kept washing dishes, her back to them. She heard every word, and so did I. We were all asking the same questions she didn't dare speak aloud. That night, my shift ended late. As I passed the basement stairs, I saw a sliver of light under Noelle's door and knew she was probably holding that old, frayed scarf of her mother's. It was the only comfort she had left. An hour later, walking past the second-floor study, I saw Mr. Ferraro sitting alone in the dark. The only thing visible was the moonlight on that broken music box on his desk. His hand rested on its lid, and his shoulders slumped with a familiar weight. The same grief, I realized, lived in both of them, and my job was to say nothing. The silence I'd been keeping curdled into fear on Wednesday night. It was almost 1 in the morning when I took the last bag of trash out. The whole estate was dark and still. But then I heard the crunch of shoes on the gravel drive leading to the garage. 3 shapes, moving in the shadows. I recognized Tristan immediately. Then Ford Bellini's broad shoulders filled the doorway, followed by Perry Rizzo, who slipped in behind them. My heart hammered against my ribs. Nothing good ever happened in the dark. I hid behind the large oak tree, close enough to hear their voices drift from the garage. Tristan spoke first, his tone quiet and final. This Saturday. He talked about a fake deal he'd set up at an abandoned warehouse down by the river, the kind of meeting he knew Mr. Ferraro would handle himself. He explained how the partner was a big fish, too important to send a subordinate. He was leading him into a trap, and the certainty in his voice chilled me to the bone. They were planning to kill him. What about Hugo? Ford's voice was a low rumble. That was my first thought, too. Hugo was the only real obstacle. Perry answered, his words quick and sharp like he was reading a stock ticker. He had a plan to create a fake emergency, a mess with a shipping line on the south side. He'd make it look like a typical problem, something Hugo would insist on handling personally. The message would seem routine. Hugo won't be suspicious, Tristan confirmed. By the time he realized it was a ghost chase, it would be over. Emilio goes to the warehouse alone, Tristan continued, his voice dropping. Ford confirmed their men would be inside waiting, armed. Everything ends in 5 minutes, Tristan said. Through a dusty garage window, I saw his famous smile. It wasn't charming anymore. It was a mask for a monster. After that, he said, I'm the only Ferraro left. In that moment, something in me snapped. I couldn't watch another person get erased. I backed away into the shadows, my decision made. I couldn't face them, but I could write. A single anonymous warning slipped under Hugo's door. It wasn't much, but my silence was finally over. I remember the first day it all went wrong. The voices came through the concrete, muffled at first, just a low rumble of men making plans. One was laying out a new world, a transfer of power. He spoke of family, of an empire, and how everything was about to change for all of them. Another man agreed without a second thought, his assent quick and final. A third offered just one chilling sentence, I'll be ready. I heard the first man talk about his brother, about a trust he'd always had, but then his voice turned cold. He said his brother still saw him as that 15-year-old kid who hid the night their mother died, that he thought I still needed his protection. He paused, and I could feel the smile drop from his voice. And that, he said, is his biggest mistake. After that, I heard nothing but the crunch of footsteps on gravel as 2 of them walked away, swallowed by the darkness. The last one stayed behind. In the silence, I imagined him staring up at the second floor of the mansion, at the one door that was always locked, where his brother was. He was there longer than he had to be, and in the stillness of the Lake Forest night, a whisper bled through the wall. I'm sorry, Mom. Then colder. But Father chose the wrong son. What none of them knew, what he never could have guessed, was that I was on the other side of that wall, just inches away, in the laundry room, because that was my job. It was nearly 1 in the morning, and I was stuck there until the last load was dry. And that night, the laundry was endless. The laundry room is tucked away in the basement, right next to the garage, sharing a wall no one bothered to soundproof. Because really, who would be down there at 1 a.m. to hear anything? Except the washing machines. I was folding bath towels when I heard them. At first, it was just background noise, indistinct, lost in the hum of the washer. I paid it no mind. Then, the machine switched cycles. The loud churning softened, and in that brief window of quiet, a single word cut through the wall. Alio. My hands stopped moving. The towel I was holding slipped from my grasp and fell to the concrete floor, but I didn't pick it up. I stood perfectly still, my head tilted, listening. The voices were clearer now, enough for me to know there were several people on the other side. I moved toward the wall, slow and quiet, my worn sneakers making no sound on the floor. I pressed my ear against the wall. Cold. The chill seeped right into my skin, but I ignored it because I could hear them so much better. The warehouse in Pilsen. Hugo won't be there. He'll come alone. My heart started to beat faster, a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She recognized those voices. The first, smooth and full of authority, was Tristan. The second, deep and short, was Ford. And the third, sharp and impatient, was Perry. I pressed my ear harder against the cold concrete, held my breath, and just listened. When Amelia walks in, lock the door. Everything ends in 5 minutes. The only Ferraro left. Each sentence felt like a punch to the gut. I couldn't wrap my head around what I was hearing. His brother, his own flesh and blood, and he was planning to kill him. I had to back away. I needed to leave that wall, to pretend I heard nothing, to go back to my towels and just forget. I took one clumsy step backward. My foot caught the edge of the water bucket. It tipped. Water crashed onto the concrete floor with a deafening clatter. In the dead of night, it sounded like an explosion. I froze. On the other side of the wall, the talking stopped instantly. Silence. Absolute silence. Then Ford's voice, low and sharp. Is someone there? My hands flew to my mouth, stifling a terrified gasp. I was sure they could hear my heart pounding through the wall. I heard heavy footsteps getting closer. Not to the wall, but to the laundry room door. Ford was coming around through the basement hall. I looked around wildly. The room was tiny. The overhead bulb had burned out earlier, leaving just the blinking red light on the dryer. 2 giant washing machines were pushed against the far wall. A mountain of clean clothes sat on the folding table. I slid to the floor, jamming myself into the space behind the biggest machine, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to disappear into the shadows. The water from the bucket was spreading across the floor, cold as ice as it soaked my shoes, but I didn't move a muscle. The doorknob turned. The laundry room door swung open. Light from the hallway cut a long stripe across the wet floor, stopping less than a foot from where I was hiding. Ford stood in the doorway. I couldn't see his face, just his massive, threatening shadow stretching over the floor. He looked around the room. The washers hummed. The dryer blinked its little red light. The clothes were in a pile. The bucket was on its side. "There's no one here," Ford said, his voice still tense but losing its edge. "Probably a stray cat got in, or the bucket tipped over by itself." 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The stripe of light shrank as the door swung shut. The footsteps moved away, up the stairs, and then they were gone. I still didn't dare to move. I just sat there behind the washing machine in a puddle of freezing water, both hands covering my mouth, my entire body shaking so badly I couldn't stop it. Tears slipped through my fingers and dripped onto my knees. But I didn't make a sound. Not because I wanted to be brave, but because I knew that if Ford had come back and found me there, if he realized I had heard everything, I would have never walked out of that basement alive. I don't know how long I sat there shaking. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour. When I finally found the strength to stand, my legs were numb and stiff from the cold water, and I had to hold on to the machine to keep from falling over. I peeked out of the laundry room into the empty basement hall. No one. I crept back to my room, forcing my feet to stay light when all I wanted to do was run. Run out of that house, out of that city, and go somewhere no one knew my name, where murder wasn't planned through a wall at 1 in the morning. Inside my room, I locked the door, but the silence did nothing to quiet my fear, or the crushing guilt. I tore a scrap of paper from an old receipt and grabbed a pen. My hand trembled, making the letters shaky, but I wrote it down. Pilsen Warehouse is a trap. And I slid the note under my door, pushing it far into the hall. It was a tiny act, a whisper against a storm, but it was better than the silence I almost chose. I remember the day she first came here, how the light just seemed to go out of her eyes. I saw them shove her down into that basement apartment from my spot trimming the hedges. And tonight, I can almost feel her terror through the stone walls, curled up on that cold floor. I imagine her heart hammering, his brother's words echoing in her head, just like they are in mine. The warehouse, no guards, the last Ferraro. I saw them talking near the laundry vents. I couldn't hear everything, but I saw Tristan's face. Now she's trapped. Tell the boss? The same man who looks right through her, who banished her downstairs? To tell him his own blood is plotting to kill him? She's a maid buried in debt, and he's the man who holds the family's entire fortune. Who would ever believe her over him? Tristan, the loyal brother for 17 years. The man who runs the whole empire. And her? She's the girl who broke something precious, a ghost he wants to erase. I knew it the moment I saw Tristan's cold smile that if she talks and isn't believed, she's gone. Not maybe, not might be, just gone. People like us, who see too much and have no power, we have a short shelf life. But if she keeps her mouth shut, pretends she saw nothing? Then on Saturday, Mr. Emilio walks into that warehouse and never walks out. And a part of me, the cowardly part I hate, asks why she should risk her life for him? I've seen the way he treats her, and the question hangs in the air between us even if he doesn't know I exist. It's a rotten thing to think, but I can't help it. He stuck her in that damp basement, works her to the bone for 19 hours a day, and treats her like she's less than air. He stripped away what little pride she had left after she'd already lost everything. Does a man like that deserve to be saved? Then, through the small basement window, I see her looking at something on her tiny bed. It's an old wool scarf. I've seen her with it before. As she stares at it, something in her changes. The panic seems to drain away, replaced by a quiet strength. It's like she's listening to a voice only she can hear, a voice that's warm and steady, telling her what she has to do. Always do what's right, even when it hurts, even when you're scared. That's how you hold on to yourself. You can lose it all, but you can't lose your soul. I watch as she holds that scarf, tears streaming down her face, but they're different now. Not tears of fear, but of resolve. I can't just let him die, I imagine her whispering, her promise echoing in my own silent, guilty heart. If I stay quiet, what does that make me? She wipes her eyes, her choice made. But how? She doesn't have his number. None of us do. We have Hugo's emergency line, but I overheard the plan. Hugo's being sent on a wild goose chase across town on Saturday. He won't be there to answer. She needs Mr. Emilio's direct line. I feel a knot of shame in my gut. I should help her, but I'm frozen. Then I remember. Last week I was trimming the roses outside his office window. I saw her inside, dusting. She'd accidentally knocked a drawer open. Inside was one of those old leather-bound phone directories. I saw her glance at it for just a second before shutting it, but her eyes had frozen on an open page. His name. A set of numbers. She wouldn't have dared write it down, but I bet anything she memorized it. I remember seeing a flicker of recognition on her face. Maybe the last 4 digits meant something to her. A birthday, an anniversary. It's a long shot, a gamble, but it's the only card she has to play. I watch her place the scarf gently back on her pillow, a final silent goodbye. I'll do what's right, her posture seems to say, even if I'm afraid. And I knew that on Saturday, with the whole house asleep and Mr. Emilio about to walk into that trap, she would make that call. She would dial those last four numbers from memory and pray. 3 days crawled by, each one an eternity. I watched her moving like a ghost, scrubbing, polishing, washing, but her soul was somewhere else. It was back in that laundry room, listening to that snake Tristan hiss about the last Ferraro. She wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping. Every shadow probably made her jump. Now, tonight, Saturday. The whole mansion feels wrong, holding its breath before a storm. The air is heavy, thick with something awful. The usual quiet of this place is gone, replaced by a silence that screams. Everyone's vanished into their rooms. The grounds are empty. It's just the dim hallway light and the clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow counting down to midnight. Through the second-floor window, I can see his silhouette. Mr. Emilio in front of his mirror. Black suit, black shirt. He moves with a lethal grace, checking his jacket, his face a mask I've seen for years. The gun at his side is just part of him, like an extra limb. I see his phone light up. A text. It must be from Tristan. Everything's set. See you there. All part of the lie. I see him nod to himself in the reflection. He trusts his brother completely. That's the poison of it all. As he puts the phone away, it rings. I know it's Hugo. I can't hear the words, but I can imagine the tone. Urgent. A problem on the south side. A shipment in Englewood gone dark. A perfect distraction. I see Mr. Emilio's posture barely change. Trouble down south is business as usual, but the timing is too perfect to be a coincidence. But he doesn't see it. He asks a question. Hugo's reply must be convincing. An urgent problem that can't wait until morning, a whole shipment at risk. Mr. Emilio is quiet for a moment. Hugo is his most trusted man. If Hugo says it's real, he believes it. Angelwood needs a heavy hitter. Go, he would have said. I'll handle the warehouse. I can picture Hugo on the other end, hesitating, arguing. In all his years, he's never let the boss go to a meet alone. Let me handle it and come back. Let me send someone else. But that one word from Mr. Emilio, go, would have been enough. It's a command, not a suggestion. The call ends. I watch Hugo's car pull away, speeding toward a setup, leaving his boss completely exposed. Mr. Emilio puts his phone in his pocket, grabs his keys. He pats the gun at his side one last time, pure muscle memory. Then he leaves the bedroom and walks down the hall, his footsteps echoing. He stops at that oak door he never opens, the one to the room where the music box broke. He just stands there, and for a split second, the mask slips. He's not looking at the wood. He's looking at a memory, something broken and lost. Then it's gone. He turns and comes down the stairs, each step confident, sure. The sound of a man walking straight to his own execution. And as he nears the back door, I see her shadow slip out from the hallway, ready. My heart pounds. I grab a piece of charcoal from the garden bed and a dry leaf. I write 2 words, Pilsen Trap. Then I run to the side gate, to the spot where Hugo's most loyal man always starts his patrol. It's not much. It might be nothing, but it's not silence. I first saw that darkness in him when he was just a boy, a shadow that never left his eyes. Tonight, that same shadow was there as he met those men by the garage. I watched Mr. Emilio walk toward the main door, and then I saw her. The new girl, Noel, frozen solid, a wet cloth clenched in her hand. Her face was a mask of terror I knew all too well, the kind that steals your voice. I knew what she must have heard, and my cowardice kept me polishing silver that felt heavier by the second. The engine turned over, a deep rumble of finality. He was leaving, walking straight into the trap they'd set. Then I saw her drop the rag. She didn't walk. She flew, a desperate blur across the cold marble floor, vanishing down the stairs to the basement. She disappeared into the staff quarters. My own hands were trembling. For years, survival in this house meant seeing nothing, and I had perfected the art. But that girl, she had a fire I hadn't seen in ages. I could only pray she was calling for help. The car continued to idle, its low growl counting down the final seconds. The screen on the wall clock read 11:47 at night. Any moment now, he would be gone for good. My silence was a cage I had built for myself, link by link. I squeezed my eyes shut, a random memory surfacing. Her mother's birthday, she'd once told me. December 23rd. 1223. Those were the last 4 digits of his private line, a code I'd seen in the house directory, but had forced myself to forget. Had she seen them too? It was a reckless, desperate hope. Calling that number was a death sentence for any of us. I kept my eyes fixed on the hallway, expecting him to walk out to the car. But he paused, just out of sight. Then I heard it, the low vibration of a phone. Not his usual one, the internal intercom. My heart seized in my chest. That call was coming from the basement. It was her. It had to be her. An internal call, this late. I was sure he would ignore it. His finger would swipe decline, and that would be the end. But a lifetime of instinct must have stayed his hand. 20 years in his world taught you that calls at the wrong time were the ones that mattered most. I heard his voice, a single sharp word that sliced the air. Speak. The cold impatience in it chilled me to the bone. After a pause, I heard him again, his voice slower, questioning. Who is this? He must have asked. A longer silence followed, and I could picture the girl, Noelle, her name a fragile whisper. I thought he was about to hang up. I thought he would dismiss her and walk out that door, and everything would be over. But he didn't. He gave her 30 seconds. I couldn't hear her, but I could imagine the words tumbling out, laced with terror, but clear as a bell. The laundry room, Wednesday night. The thin wall next to the garage. I'd seen those men there myself. Tristan, Ford, Perry. She was telling him about the plan. The fake report sending Hugo to the south side. How he would walk into the Pilsen warehouse all alone. Her voice must have cracked then, telling him what they'd said. When it's done, Tristan will be the only Ferraro left. From the hall, I saw the rigid line of Mr. Almelio's back. He didn't move, didn't interrupt. He just stood there, absorbing every single word, letting the poison sink in. His voice, when it came, was a low whisper. Why? Not a question of suspicion, but of genuine shock. A man so used to betrayal he couldn't comprehend an act of loyalty. In that one word, I heard the profound loneliness of his life. I couldn't hear Noelle's reply, only the sound of her quiet sobs through the line. But I knew what she was saying. Because my mother taught me. Because it's the right thing to do. She was reminding him of a world he'd left behind long ago. She was telling him that his own mother would not want to see him die this way, at the hand of his brother. A long, piercing silence followed. Then his voice returned, the ice in it gone, replaced by a steady, clear resolve. He told her to lock her door. Then the call ended. For a full minute, he remained completely still in the hallway, the phone in his right hand, the car keys in his left. The engine was still running, a faithful monster waiting for its master. He looked down at the keys, then he calmly set them on the small table beside him. He didn't throw them in a rage. He simply laid them down, as if setting aside a life built on a terrible lie. Then he turned and went upstairs. To the bedroom. To the bottom drawer he had sworn he would never open again. Inside was the other gun. The one he only used when words were no longer enough. He picked up his phone and called Hugo. Boss, there's nothing here. I still remember the first time I saw the crack form, years ago, when the old man gave Alio the family ring, but only gave Tristan a pat on the back. I saw the look in Tristan's eyes that day. So when Hugo called us to the Pilsen warehouse, I knew the bill was finally due. We slipped in from the riverside, the air thick with the stench of motor oil and decay. The place was a carcass, just 4 rusted walls and a roof shot through with holes, a perfect tomb for the night. From my spot in the shadows, I watched Tristan stroll in. He scanned the place like he already owned it. 4 of his guys were in place, tucked behind corroded shipping containers, armed and silent. Ford stood guard by the massive front door, one hand inside his coat, his eyes glued to the dark road. Perry, the money man, hung back near the rear exit. Perry wasn't a trigger man. He was the one who erased things, who made sure the stories ended here. When Tristan checked his watch at 11:55, a knot of guilt tightened in my stomach. "He'll be on time," Tristan said to Ford, his voice soft, almost bored. "Alio is never late. It's one of the things Dad gave him." Ford just grunted, never taking his eyes off the road. The minutes crawled by in a dead silence, broken only by the river lapping against the concrete and the wind moaning through the holes in the roof. Then, Ford's voice cut the quiet, low and sharp. "Lights." Everyone stiffened. 2 beams sliced through the blackness, coming closer. A big black SUV I knew by heart. Alio's ride. A faint, triumphant smile touched Tristan's lips. "Exactly on time," he whispered. His hand started to lift to give the signal, but it never finished the journey. Before he could condemn his own blood, we erupted from the darkness he'd overlooked. I slammed Ford face first into the concrete floor before he could even process it. A decade of guarding doors, dreaming of a seat at the table, ended with his nose full of motor oil and dust. Perry didn't even try. He just threw his hands up, his face ghostly white and his eyes clenched shut, wishing it all away. We shoved them against the far wall. Their part in the play was over. There's not much to say once you're on the floor. All that was left standing were the 2 of them, Alio and Tristan. 3 steps of empty space between them felt heavier than 17 years of bad blood. The headlights from the SUV streamed in, painting long, distorted shadows on the ground. And in that raw light, they weren't the boss and the underling anymore. They were just 2 boys, the same 2 who once shared a room, now standing on opposite sides of a war they'd built themselves. Tristan finally broke the silence, not because he wanted to, but because it was crushing him. "How long have you known?" he asked, trying to keep his voice from shaking. I could hear the tremor, though. "Long enough," Alio answered, giving him nothing. That's when something inside Tristan shattered. All the years of fake smiles and obedient nods finally exploded. "You took everything!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the steel. "Father always chose you. Always. What was I? A shadow. Your damn shadow for 17 years. Just nodding along, never seen, never heard." He was heaving now, his eyes burning but dry. "I have the Ferraro name too. But to you, to him, I was just the one who came second. Never good enough." His voice died out, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I braced for Alio's rage, but what I saw on his face wasn't anger. It was a profound, soul-deep sadness, the kind of sorrow you see when something precious is broken beyond repair. "You think I wanted any of this?" Alio asked, his voice quiet, no longer the boss but just an older brother. "I watched Mother die, Tristan. I was 19 years old. Her blood was on my shirt. That night, I lost everything too. I lost my youth, the ability to trust, the chance to sleep a single night without waking up to nightmares." He stopped, breathing deep. "And now, I've lost you." Those words landed like stones. Tristan flinched, his throat working as he fought back the tears he'd mastered hiding. "So what?" he finally managed, his voice brittle. "You'll kill me anyway, right? That's the code. Betrayal is death. Your law. Father's law. So do it." He spread his arms wide, his chest exposed. "Do it, Alio." For a moment that lasted forever, nobody breathed. We were all waiting for the gunshot. But it never came. Alio just looked at his brother, at the boy he failed to protect all those years ago. Then he turned to Hugo, his voice hollow. "Take him. Get him out of the city, out of the country. Leave him somewhere he can't come back from. Hugo gave a single nod. Alio looked at Tristan one last time. If you return, he said, and his voice became absolute zero, we won't be talking. Tristan stood frozen, his mouth open, the mask of defiance finally gone. He was just a younger brother who understood, too late, what he had just thrown away. Hugo took his arm. He didn't fight. He walked toward the door like a dead man, pausing for a fraction of a second when he passed Alio, as if some part of him wanted to stay. Then he was gone into the night. Ford and Perry followed soon after. Hugo would handle it. When they were all gone, Alio just stood in the center of the vast, empty space, a solitary figure caught in the glare of the headlights. He didn't move or speak. He looked like a man who'd won a war and lost the world. During the scuffle, a small photo had fallen from Tristan's jacket. I picked it up. It was them, as kids. I stepped out, laid it on a nearby crate where he would see it, and disappeared back into the shadows. It was all I could do. A great emptiness settled over the house, the kind that comes after a rot has finally been cut out, leaving a clean wound. I knew he had saved himself, but in doing so, had lost the last person who shared his name. I sat in my own small room in the dark, my back against the wall, knees drawn to my chest, my mother's old rosary wrapped around my fist. I didn't know if Noel knew whether he was alive or dead. We were both just waiting in the suffocating quiet. Every floorboard creak was a gunshot. Then, I felt a faint vibration through the floor. Her phone. A text from the number she had called. I held my breath. I heard her read it once, then again. I heard a small, choked gasp. It's done. You were right. She finally let the phone fall, pressing her face into a scarf, and a flood of tears poured out, quiet and unrestrained. Thank God, she whispered, her voice raw. Thank God. Sunday morning arrived slowly, the light seeming to hesitate at the windows of the great house. The silence was still there, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was lighter, as if the whole estate had finally exhaled. I found her up at 5, just like always. She hadn't slept, not a minute. Her eyes were red and raw, her skin almost translucent. Her hands still had a slight tremble as she straightened her uniform buttons. She didn't know what the new day would hold for her. She didn't know if he would thank her or discard her for knowing too much. Either was possible. She began her morning duties, cleaning, wiping, washing, her hands moving on their own, while her mind was miles away, in a warehouse in Pilsen. Then I heard his footsteps. Hugo. He stood in the kitchen entrance, his face unreadable, but his gaze on her had changed. He wasn't looking at a maid. He was looking at the woman who had saved his boss. The boss wants to see you, he said. In the sitting room. She nodded, her face pale. As she walked past me, I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I reached out and touched her arm. When she looked at me, I gave a small, firm nod. A silent promise. You are not alone. I remember the first day I brought her here. She was just a kid, really, following me down this same hallway, her eyes wide with a fear I'd seen 1,000 times. I didn't think much of it then. Now, watching her walk toward the sitting room this morning, I see how wrong I was. The boss was by the window, staring out at nothing. Sunlight sliced across the marble, but it couldn't touch the exhaustion that clung to him. It wasn't just from last night. It was the kind of tired that comes from a wound deep inside, a betrayal that takes something from you forever. It was in the slump of his shoulders, the way he just stood there, as if the light itself was the only thing holding him up. When he turned at her footstep, their eyes met. I'd only ever seen him look through her like she was furniture. But not today. Today, he saw her. I could feel it from the doorway. He was really looking at her. Sit down, he said, and the authority was gone from his voice. It was just a man talking to a woman. I should have walked away, but my feet were bolted to the floor. She sat, spine straight, hands clasped, but her gaze met his. She wasn't afraid anymore. Something had broken between them last night, some unspoken rule about who was allowed to look at whom. He put his coffee down. I doubt he'd even had a sip. When he finally spoke, the words came out slow, heavy. I didn't get any sleep. I stood there listening, feeling like a thief. Not because of Tristan, he said, turning from the window to face her fully. Because of you, and the call you made. The silence that followed was louder than any command he'd ever given. Then, I treated you badly. And I knew it. My own chest felt tight. All those weeks I'd watched it happen. I sent you to the basement. I drove him while he gave the orders that worked her to the bone. I looked at you and chose not to see. I heard him say the words I'd thought myself. He'd had his reasons, he said, excuses he'd built in his head. But the truth is, you made one mistake. And I made you pay for it over and over. I saw her bite her lip, fighting back tears, and my own shame burned in my throat. And you, he said, his voice dropping so low I could barely hear it. You could have let me walk right into it. You could have thought, he deserves it. But you still called. The first tear escaped and ran down her cheek, but she didn't look away from him. Her voice, though it trembled, was clear. My mother always said, when you can save a life, you don't ask if they deserve it. You just do it. The boss shut his eyes. Just for a second, but I saw it. A flicker of something breaking across his face. A pain so old and deep, it was almost silent. My mother said that too, he whispered. And right there, in that sun-drenched room, it felt like the whole house held its breath. They weren't boss and servant anymore. They were just two people who'd both lost their mothers, sharing a grief that had been invisible until now. I watched him walk to the table and slide a thick envelope toward her. Open it. I knew what it would be. The first page, a release. $95,000, gone, wiped clean. The second, a check big enough for her whole nursing program at UIC, living expenses and all for 2 years. The third, an address for a safe apartment up in Lake View. Her hands were shaking as she looked at it all, then back at him. You don't owe my family anything, he told her. You're free. I can't. You can, he said, and his voice was firm, but not harsh. And you will. Because you're the only person in this whole damned world who told me the truth with nothing to gain from it. Not out of fear, not for a reward, but because it was the right thing. He looked out the window again, and it felt like he was talking to himself. My mother told me to never judge a person by their station. Judge them by what they do when no one is watching. He turned back to her. You had nothing to gain last night, Noelle. That's why I trust you more than I've trusted anyone in a very long time. She finally let the tears fall, not in shame or pain, but in relief. Like a dam had finally broken. She just sat there and cried, because after all this time, someone had finally seen her for who she was. She looked at the papers, at her freedom right there in her hands, and then she looked back at him. After wiping her eyes, she took a deep breath and said something that stunned us both. I accept, but I need 1 more month. The boss just looked at her. 1 more month here, she repeated. Not for the debt, that's gone. And not because I'm scared. I'm not. But because... She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quiet, but solid as oak. Because nobody should have to be alone after that. You didn't just lose a brother to death, you lost him to betrayal. I think that's a worse kind of empty. This place is going to feel different now, and I know what it's like to be by yourself in a big, empty house after losing someone. For a long time, the boss just stared at her. The sunlight caught the side of her face, and I knew what he was seeing. Not pity, not some angle she was playing. Just the honest truth from someone who knew his kind of pain. Someone offering not to fix it, but just to be there, so the silence wouldn't be so loud. And then I saw something I've never seen before. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. It wasn't a real smile, more like the idea of one, like the first sign of sun after a week of rain. "You're the strangest person I've ever met, Noel Ashford," he said. She didn't smile back, but I saw the weight lift from her shoulders. A month later, I was the one who drove her. She stood at the gate of the Lake Forest estate, that same canvas bag slung over her shoulder. But this time, it held her future inside. It held hope. Before she got in the car, I stopped. The words were stuck in my throat, words I hadn't said to anyone in years because they didn't fit in our world. But I had to. I had watched her endure, and I had done nothing. This was the only thing I could do. "You're a good person." Just 3 words. But for me, they were a confession and a thank you. She smiled, a real one this time. "Thank you, Hugo." She didn't look back at the house, but I did. I saw him standing in the second-floor window. He watched us pull away, watched until the car was just a speck, and I know he stayed there long after we were gone. A kitchen and a window that looked out onto a quiet, tree-lined street. The light that came through was warm, and for the first time in forever, Noel had a home. She didn't have much to unpack, but she hung a worn wool scarf on the wall like it was a priceless piece of art. To her, I suppose it was. 3 days later, the boss called me into his office. He handed me a small, unmarked box. "Take this to her address. Leave it at the door. Make sure no one sees you." I drove to Lakeview and placed the package on her doorstep. I didn't knock. I just left it there, his silent message. Inside, I knew, was a music box. A new one. His way of replacing what was lost. As I walked away, I felt a flicker of hope. She hadn't just saved him. She had reminded him of who he used to be. And I was the one who got to see it happen. I remember the first day I saw her. She looked like a ghost, all haunted eyes and trembling hands, moving into the apartment next door. For months, I'd hear things through the wall. A muffled cry, a sharp, angry voice, and sometimes a sad little melody from a music box. Tonight, I hear that same tune again, but it's different, clearer, unafraid. It floats from under her door, and for the first time in what feels like forever, it doesn't sound like a secret. I saw the package delivered earlier, a small wooden box. I imagine her opening it, finding a note inside, something that finally tells her she wasn't crazy, that someone saw her strength. I see the light on in her window, and I can almost feel the tears rolling down her face. Not the kind I used to hear at night, the ones born from terror, but tears of release. The kind that comes after you've walked through hell and found you can still breathe on the other side. And I think of him, the man on the news, Alio, from that mansion in Lake Forest, and I finally understand. The papers always painted him as some kind of monster. I guess I believed it too, especially when I saw what his world did to the poor girl next door. But now I wonder if he was just as trapped as she was. I imagine him in that big, empty house, that one room on the second floor always dark. Maybe someone finally fixed that broken music box for him, the cracks still there like old wounds that never quite fade. Maybe the song it plays now sounds a little broken too, like a voice that has forgotten how to sing. I picture him sitting there, listening to that melody in the quiet, and for the first time, not being the powerful boss everyone fears, but just a boy who lost his mother, a man drowning in the silence. I should have done something. I remember one night hearing a crash, and I just turned my television up louder. My silence makes me a part of it, and the guilt is a heavy, bitter thing. He was seen for what he was, and the person he relied on the most was the one who left him in the dark. The one who betrayed him was family. The one who saved him was a stranger he'd tried to break. It's funny how life works. You think loyalty is bought with money or power, but it's not. It comes from people who have nothing to give but their own decency. People like her, who choose to do the right thing, even when their hands are shaking, when they know it could cost them everything. I made a mistake by staying quiet, by choosing fear over courage. But maybe what you do after the mistake is what really counts. I have the security footage from the hallway camera from that night. I was too scared to look at it before, too scared to get involved. But not anymore. I download the file onto a small flash drive, my hands shaking just like hers used to. That is my story. A story of how I stood by and listened, and finally decided to do more than just hear. It's not just her story to tell anymore. It's a quiet reminder that even the person standing silently beside you can find their voice. I slip the drive into a small envelope and drop it in the mail, addressed to the lead detective on the case. No note, no name, just the truth. My heart hammers against my ribs, but for the first time, it feels like a hopeful rhythm. This simple act won't erase my silence, but it's a start. It's my promise to myself to never just be a bystander again. I hope this one small piece of the truth helps her story be heard, and I hope it inspires someone else to not look away. I hope she gets to live a life full of joy and peace, surrounded by people who love her, and I hope she knows she wasn't as alone as she thought. Thank you for being brave, Noelle. You made me brave too. I go back to my apartment, and for the first time in a long time, the silence doesn't feel like fear. It feels like peace. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.